My guest today is Nastassja Swift, a multidisciplinary artist holding a BFA from Virginia Commonwealth University. Nastassja was recently invited to Penland School of Crafts Winter Residency as a distinguished fellow. She was the 2021 Summer Artist in Residence with Spaces in Cleveland, where her community parade and exhibition received support from the Ohio Arts Council. In 2019, her short film and collaborative performance, Remembering Her Homecoming, premiered at the Afrikana Independent Film Festival and screened at the Virginia Film Festival in Charlottesville. She is the recipient of a 2021 Dr. Doris Derby Award, the Art Matters 2021 Fellowship Award, the Black Box Press Foundation 2021 Art as Activism Grant, and the 2020 Virginia Commission of the Arts Fellowship. Her work has been acquired into the Grace Linton Battle Memorial Fund for the Arts Collection, as well as Quirk Hotel in Charlottesville. Nastassja has been included in the Berlin publication, Some Magazine, RVA Magazine, RHome Magazine, and The Stranger, a Seattle publication. She has participated in several national and international residencies and exhibitions, including her solo exhibit in Doha, Qatar in 2016, Virginia MoCA, the Urban Institute of Contemporary Art in Michigan, and fellowships at the Vermont Studio Center and Mass MoCA. Nastassja Swift is currently living and working in Virginia, and I'm so glad to talk to her today. It's been a long time coming. How are you doing?
I'm good. Are you out of breath? No, I'm just kidding.
No, I was just like, wow, I get to talk to someone with such impressive accolades. I love it.
Yeah, I'm a long sentence writer and very much an Alice Walker.
I love it. I love it. Hey. I mean, going over your accomplishments, especially in the last few years, is really impressive. I mean, having international, national exhibitions and all of these residencies, it's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, can we actually just start off the conversation by talking about these? How did you? I'm always interested in, what artists find that they get out of residencies, and how they change the work that you create or that you're thinking about your work.
Yeah, so my first residency was actually like actually July after I graduated from VCU. So I graduated spring 2015 in May. And I remember like the last few months of right before graduation, I kept getting like, what are you going to do when you graduate? And I was like, I don't know. Like, can you let me breathe so I can figure that out? And like, crazily enough, towards the end of that year, of that school year, I found out about the Vermont Studio Center as well as the residency in Doha, Qatar. And I remember just being super excited to kind of like quickly transition from this academic art space into what felt like this real art world where I was like going to be around artists who are, practicing their craft professionally without the confines of academia, and not knowing what that would look like. And the beautiful thing about those two, they were literally back to back. So I was in Vermont the month of July, took a train back to Virginia and flew out to Doha the next week. And the exciting thing about doing those back to back in that way, Vermont Studio Center was only 4 weeks. And I remember going in and I was like, okay, well, I'm going to do this 4-week residency and then I'm going to do this 9-month residency. How do I want to tackle my time? And it kind of set a really nice tone for how I wanted to interact and work in that space while being in Vermont first. And it was like, okay, I'm not going to go in with any like preconceived plans or work. I'm just going to bring everything that I have and we're just going to make. So each day, like I would kind of break my day up into like, I had a fiber corner, I had a paper corner, I had a painting corner. And for breakfast, after breakfast, I would go and like do some painting. And then after lunch, I would go and do some felting. And then later in the day, I would just like start ripping up paper and seeing what would happen. And that felt really good to then transition into a longer residency, going to Doha and feeling like I could pace myself out. And ever since then, I think I've just really enjoyed like the space to even be able to do that, like to be able to choose whether I'm going to pace or play, whether I want to plan something out. Even like the past residency that I just did at Penland, I was only there for 2 weeks, but it was so nice to be there and not be bothered for 2 weeks about anything, like not have to consider like, you know, getting my studio space together or whatever. It was just like, okay, 2 weeks, which isn't a long amount of time, but also like getting to figure out how you're building your community. And that's always a really nice way. So actually one of the people in the chat, I saw she typed that she's here, Avery Williamson, who's in Michigan. I met her at a residency in 2019. It was a week long. And we just kind of like immediately clicked in terms of like our energy, but also the work and the conversations that our work was having. And it's cool to think that like a space or opportunity such as a residency, which also sometimes feels like an artist's work vacation, depending on how you but like fosters these relationships and these conversations that get to extend far past that week or 2 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever it may be. And then just develop into like how we're building on our practices individually, but also collectively. So that's always a real treat when something special, like a relationship developing through our work gets to happen. So thanks, Avery, for joining today.
Welcome, Avery.
We're in a 2-person show in Richmond, Virginia at Quirk Gallery. So that was the first time. Our opening was 2 weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
I've seen her since meeting her in it's called Cuddy Hunk Artist Residence. It's a little island off of Massachusetts. And we hadn't seen each other since then, but we've kept in contact and we would do like these FaceTime critiques. And I've been able to do that with other artists that I've met in residencies. So it's just like a really beautiful way to connect and just to extend this network or community past like what I know in my immediate bubble that I call home.
That is incredible. Wow. You also mentioned all of these different media of working. I didn't realize that you painted. I mean, I can see behind you right now that clearly you draw. So, you know, I haven't seen, I haven't seen any of your painting yet. And so that's something I definitely am really interested in knowing a little bit more about.
So my background, I've actually only been felting and working with fiber for the past 8 years, which to say only because 8 years feels like a long time. But when I think about all that I did before that, I fell in love with art through drawing. And then as I got into high school, oil painting became like this medium that I was obsessed with. And I've always worked figuratively, whether it was on paper or canvas, and now through fiber. And when I got to VCU, I was like, I'm a painting major. Like it's painting and printmaking, but I could have cared less about the printmaking. I was like, I don't want to etch anything. I just did not enjoy. And I ended up actually really loving printmaking, but through lithography. So most of my undergraduate time at VCU was spent doing painting and printmaking. And then I slowly kind of got into fiber after I decided to make craft and material studies my minor. But I've always loved, like, I remember visiting VCU as a high school student and all my friends were like, oh my God, there goes Nastassja. And I was like, you could just feel the oil paint on your skin. It's like really intimate connection with oil painting. And it's funny to hear you say that, like, oh, I didn't know you painted, where like people who are really close to me want me to paint again. Like a friend of mine I was talking to was like, when are you gonna paint again? And I was like, I don't really have any interest to. And I think, and I shouldn't say that, I don't have an interest to paint with oil paint in the conventional sense that I was doing before. I still feel like I'm painting with these masks. I feel like I'm painting with when I'm working with quilted materials. There's a way that I'm thinking about the color and the material that I was always thinking about when I was painting figuratively. So it just feels like I'm speaking the same language, just through a different font. And who knows if painting will circle its way back around. I will tell you, the only time I actually do paint is when my dad requests a painting from me. He has this obsession with thinking that all my art is meant for his house. So Anita Baker and a Sade painting, and he's expecting one from me this year. We've spaced it out. I was like, you don't get a painting every year. I don't have time for that. We have an agreement that we'll shoot, let's see what every other year looks like. I would love to do every other 2 years, but I don't know if he'll take that. So that's the only person that gets painting from me. But yeah, like the pieces behind me, the past 2 works that I've just done, the Tapestries for Avery and I's show, they were a bit of a new idea that I had been thinking about for a couple of months towards the end of last year. So after I did my really large quilt about my brother, and I hadn't quilted up until that point since college, I just really loved building imagery and like beading in that way and introducing these fibers into my space. I really wanted to see what they looked like with wool and with felting. And as much as I love beading, it is so time consuming. I'm sure you know. And I was like, okay, well, what I'm not about to do is spend a week beading this little square and then I don't like it anymore. So I ended up doing these digital collages where I was kind of like just drawing on Photoshop to get the figures and placement. But when I knew I wanted beading in a certain area, I'd like cut and paste my previous beaded work and shift the color and put it in that area, just so I could say, okay, I like this pillow being beaded, or I know I want the shadows in my dress to be beaded, without having to feel like I was like super committing to doing that material in that process in that section. And it was super helpful. So then these drawings are just like in-person translations from the digital sketching. So that way when I'm building on top of it, I finish the beading section so I can put that where it goes, almost like working by number or painting by number, but with the kind of draft that I created for myself. So drawing's always going to find itself in my work. That's just like, I'm a visual like planner and thinker. I need to see it before I say, okay, now let's do it.
Yeah, I love that you're saying that. And the more that I look at your work and just think about it, the textures, the color, also some of the forms of it, I think that's some of the stuff that's really, amazing and surprising about your work is, I was telling you before we went live, I've dabbled a little bit with felting and I just think it's really fun and it's very therapeutic, right? Just the repeated motion of taking a needle. I've done needle felting. But the way that you're taking it and making them sculptural, but also the dimensions and the colors that you use in there, like I can clearly say that the connection to your other art practices, it's like you are drawing. It is like you're painting, but using a different material in the way that you approach color. It's not a uniform thing like a stuffed animal or a doll. And we'll get to the dolls later.
Yeah, I mean, even with this mask, and because you brought my use of color, like my application of color up, I think it's important to note that sometimes when I'm working, it feels really good to dye these objects after they're an object, because they take color very differently than if I'm just dyeing a batch of wool. So like this mask was needle felted completely, and then it was dyed. So and everyone thought I was crazy. They were like, "You're gonna dip your mask in a I was like, yeah, it's fine, it's cool, it's supposed to get wet, it'll dry. And I just had so much trust for this material, but I love it. I don't know if you can see in the lighting here, but like the back of the bamboo knots get a little lighter, and then it gets darker around certain, like where the twist of the hair kind of gets a little more concentrated, and then these needle felted faces get dyed after they're a shape also. And it almost feels like by dipping the object in the bath, it's almost like I'm painting them, because they take color a little darker in the sockets, and their lips, because they're the most lightly felted object on the face, because there's not a lot of wool in that lip area, they take the least amount of color. So it's like this natural application of gradient that happens within the objects that just feels very natural, in consideration to like the way I was working before through oil painting.
That is incredible. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because yeah, I did not know about the process, and definitely want to get into process with you. And yeah, thank you for sharing. I love that you actually are literally in the studio and have things that you can show us. That doesn't always happen on the show, but that always makes it better when we can see the place where your ideas are coming together into these products that we see at the end. But we don't get to see the whole process as it unfolds with you. I want to know how, you went to art school. What prompted you to pursue art in the first place? Like, when did you have this inkling that, hey, I'm a creative person, I'm an artist, and I need to actually pursue this and take it to the next level?
Yeah. So I tell this story. It's my favorite story to tell. So I don't mean like, oh, I tell this story all the time. But if there's if anyone in the who's joining us has heard it already, I'm sorry. But my mom used to be an artist, and I don't even like to say used to be. I think she's still an artist. She's just not making, but she'll say that she's not. And at like the age of like 4 or 5, maybe younger, she still, well, my age of 4 or 5, she still has the like old school, not cardboard, but like the built up mat board portfolio that she had in school right before she went to college, with all of her charcoal drawings from like class studies. And she liked drawing people, and she liked drawing like houses. So there's these architectural drawings, and like I consider that to be like my introduction to like a gallery or a museum, because at such a young age that was what I was seeing. And because of the amount of value that was kind of clear of what those objects were, because I couldn't just go and by myself open her portfolio and start flipping through them and eat my yogurt or whatever. It was like, only mom touches this, and she'll share it with you when she decides, and we sit and we look through it together. You can touch, but hands have to be clean. So almost like when you're like looking through archived images and you have to be really careful with them, there was like this amount of importance and value that was put on those pieces of paper. And she would probably only be the one who could tell you like how long from that moment to like me drawing all over the place, like what that duration was. But I imagine it wasn't long. And as I got older, I loved going to museums. I loved drawing her, especially in the kitchen. And she became like a little art teacher. I always joke that she wasn't the best art teacher just because she was a little too like harsh. She's like, the face doesn't have lines. And I'm like, Mom, how do you draw a face without lines then? And then I get older and I'm in like an art class and we're learning about light and shadow and tone. And like, I'm like, oh, that's what my mom was trying to tell me, saying it in a very mom-like way. So I couldn't, but it was those moments of me drawing her, and she would take a break in the kitchen. And I remember I used to love drawing hands. I would always draw her hands because it was easier to do that than sometimes trying to get the face down. And when I was in elementary school, I don't know if that was like a moment where I knew I was an artist, because I feel like I understood that I was a creative person, even if I wasn't calling it an artist. I knew that it was something that I really enjoyed. My 5th grade year, I did this project. It was like, I did this like flag piece where I drew people in the stripes of the flag, and it was a little dark because red was like kind of blood, like a blood-like reference. and I don't know what I saw or what I read or what I heard to like make me make a piece like that in 5th grade. But my art teacher loved it, and she was like, oh, you should apply for this program for 6th to 8th graders. And she helped me with my application and walked me through like the audition process and explained all the stuff to my mom. And I applied for it and I did it. So like every 1 week, 1 day out of the week, I would leave my school early in the morning and go to this like visual and performing arts academy. And I would stay there for the full day, and then the bus would take me back to my school at the end of the day, which I loved because I got to miss science, and I'm not a science person unless I'm working with natural dyes, then I really have never liked science. But that was like the only, and I don't think I've ever acknowledged it, but in this moment, as I'm telling you this story, I feel like that was like a child residency, like leaving once a week to go to this place to only make art. And we would have like ceramics in the afternoon and like drawing during the day, and it would switch each year or kind of gradually become more difficult. And from there, I kind of did the same thing in high school, except instead of leaving my school, I was just at my academy was the school that I was going to. We just were all in like the West Wing. And it was like all those academy kids over there, like the weird art kids on the other end of the school. And art has just always been like a priority in my life at that point. And my parents understood it and supported it. There was never a moment where they were like, Nastassja's doing her art thing. They're like, no, what time's your audition? Like, we'll drive an hour and a half to take you to this portfolio review. And they're still that way. But I remember like thinking about college, I started second guessing whether I wanted to do art like fully. Just because like weird peer conversations of like, what are you gonna do with an art degree? Damn, I don't know. And then like that visit to VCU, and as we started visiting other schools, I just like, there was something about seeing students sitting on the ground in between classes at the studio and like looking at the studios and looking at art all over the place. I was like, I don't care what happens after year 4, but I know that I don't want to be miserable for 4 years doing anything else. So we're going to do art and we're going to see what happens with it. So I think that like for most of my childhood and like, I guess, teenage to adult, I was pretty confident in making art happen. And there was like a little tiny rock that tried to like get thrown my way. And then luckily enough, I was able to like dodge it.
That is incredible. I mean, yeah, I think you're one of maybe 3 or 4 artists out of the like 60 plus artists that I've spoken to who were actually encouraged. And I think that comes through. It sounds like you don't even know the age. You were very, very young.
Yeah.
When your parents were just like, yes, this is art, and it sounds like it was also normalized for you. It wasn't this, oh, you can make art as a hobby or whatever, but it's like, no, you can actually do this and pursue it as far as you want.
Yeah, no, I had friends whose parents wouldn't let them go to school for art. And I think like seeing that reality up close, I've just always been super grateful that my parents are like probably my number one cheerleaders. I just was at my dad's house Sunday, and when he opened the door, he was like, "What's up, superstar?" Like, just like happy to have me over. My mom has me and Avery's work as the background of her phone and her laptop.
Wow.
My grandma yesterday just told me that when she goes to her doctor's appointments, she's telling the doctor or the nurse like, "Oh, since you have your tablet out, you should Google Nastassja Swift."
Nice.
So I have this like fan club, and it's not in a like, oh, we're trying to gas Nastassja up, but I feel like it's like everyone has like this hand that's like giving me a foot up to support me, whether it like in any way to just like make sure I feel good about continuing on this path, which feels really good.
It does. And today says the most important fans, right?
Yeah, they probably say they're the only fans that matter.
The only ones that matter. We could give them that. Yeah. I think at this point, I actually do want to go ahead and share some images as we walk through it, and then ask all questions we can ask while we do that. So let me just let me get myself set up. Oh, what happened to it? Just 1 second. I don't know why this many years into using Zoom, I still somehow have issues with it. It makes no sense.
No, before every Zoom meeting talk I have to do, I'll like open up my Zoom by myself to like test it to see how things look before I have to enter into the space with people in public.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
Um, so let's see. We're getting a look at them all right now. I hope no one's seeing, you're not seeing my little dashboard thing, right?
No, it's good now.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you. All right, awesome. Well, yeah, this piece, I know this is just actually a detail. This is not the whole piece at all, but I definitely want to get into that. Your work tells stories. You're not simply making objects, but there's something deeper going on with the work. And I'd love to hear, and here's a little zoom in on the same image. I'd just love to hear, what are the narratives and histories or stories that you're mining with creating these absolutely stunning pieces?
Yeah. So I pull from a couple of different like areas. A lot of these stories and I call myself a storyteller, and I think about myself as like a narrator. If narrator was like synonymous with artist, that's kind of how I see myself. And a lot of the starting points for the work that I'm making oftentimes comes from texts that I'm reading, or images that I'm looking at, conversations that I have. Black women writers are a major inspiration from where I'm pulling as like these starting points for how I can reimagine these stories. This piece in particular, which is titled Passage, When Mama Lets My Braids Flow Down My Back. So the fact that it's the full figure, which you can't see fully in this photo, but you see a bit of the braids around the neck, that kind of starts this silhouette form of what I consider to be the body that spills onto the floor. But when thinking about this piece, which is kind of a second part to a series I started but haven't finished, my studio mate at the time, Mahari Chapwera, she's a painter based in Virginia as well, but she had a series of African mask books in her studio floor. And I remember just like, she wasn't even there that day. I just went over and I was like, oh, Mahari has these books. I had an idea in my mind, but I needed to like see an image. And I really didn't care to Google it. I just wanted to like look through a book and kind of have that moment. And there was an image of this Benin head that had this coiled object around its neck. And this, what looked like, it was all metal, but it looked like there was like a woven piece of fabric like draped over the top of the head. And I remember seeing that image and a couple of other masks, and I took pictures of them and sketches and notes. And I started thinking about who the people were that we were seeing in these sculptures, or what person or figure might have been referenced in these masks. And that led me down this like rabbit hole of thinking about spirituality and religion and worship, and wanting to like then question or challenge the definition of worship, or the potential of many definitions of the word worship, thinking about like who we often idolize or worship, but what happens when we choose to reposition that word towards people that we care about and people that we know, and what does it mean to like worship a best friend, but not in the traditional sense, but thinking of that word in a different way, as like an honor, or understanding that there's something of immense value that you're getting from that person, and they deserve to be kind of put into this spiritual object of some sort that brings comfort or security or something to your space. And how I think about what traditional African mask or objects might have done. So with all of that under my mind, when I saw those coiled pieces around the neck, I immediately thought about felted faces, mimicking that coiled shape, and wanting to see that around the face of someone that I know. So this was actually my studio assistant at the time, but before she was a studio assistant, we talked about her. She was my mentee. So I was a part of this it's a youth art organization in Richmond called Art 180. And I was a mentor to Brianna for 2 years. And then when she graduated high school and went to a college that was close to where I was doing a residency, she kind of transitioned into being a studio assistant. So, and this was all during the pandemic, and going from being her mentor, and which I still kind of see myself as, there was a relationship. So it wasn't like I just picked the studio assistant off of Instagram and decided to make a piece about her. We had been going into this 3-year relationship where I felt like I was gaining as much from her as she probably would say she was gaining from me as a mentor. And so I was like, okay, I think I want to do this piece about Bree, especially because of her age and her being much younger than me. And I'll get into the specifics of the story behind this piece. But I also just really loved her Bantu knots the day I photographed her. And I was like, Bree, your hair looks really good and it's inspiring me right now. And I need to see this figure for this, this sculpture in that hairstyle. And with these spaces around the neck. So what the title speaks to is thinking about when I was a certain age, and thinking about almost like this rites of passage and things that signify that. I remember there was a point where I could only get certain hairstyles, like my hair it couldn't be too grown, as my mom would say it, you know? And then at some point it transitioned into, you can straighten your hair, or you can get longer braids if you want, or you can style it in this way, and thinking about the way in which hair in part kind of becomes this signifier for like a transition into an older age, if that makes sense. And because of it, and thinking about like a rites of passage and thinking about community, especially thinking about not only the community of hair, but the community of hair in Black spaces, and like what it means to get your hair done, what it means to be able to get your hair done in a certain style, the way we see hairstyles in public, and it's like, ooh, I love her braids. And then hair in this piece just became almost like monumental, that I wanted it to be emphasized in a really strong way. So these bright pink beads flowing from the floor speaks to that length. But what's also important about the beads is that I didn't make them. I found 2 hairstylists that were close to where I was doing a residency in Newport News, Virginia, that made the beads for me. And that feels really special because I don't braid hair, but if I go get my hair braided, I'm going to a stylist. So these 2 women become a part of the story. They become a part of the community of, if Bree was this 11-year-old or 12-year-old that's going to be 13 and now can get her hair braided, and there's this moment or this ceremony that happens where these 2 Black women come and braid her hair all the way down to the floor, and we're celebrating this transition into her life. And I don't even need everyone to know all of that, but I think about my work being a snapshot or a moment of this larger story that I'm writing, and you get to see Bree with her braids flowing down her back, while I know that there was this community of women that came together to construct this moment for her and to celebrate her entering into this new phase of her life.
Oh my gosh, I love that. And, you know, having this community of folks around, then, you know, as you're saying that, then I'm looking at this amazing gradient of the head surrounding, you know, her neck and her chin, and thinking about how that is, you know, as you're talking about Benin sculptures now, I'm imagining the coral bead, you know, the coral beads that the royalties, you know, wear around their neck, and the way that you've rendered it, it's now these faces, you know, which is now making me think, oh, this is the community that's enwrapping, you know, her. Also thinking about ancestors. I don't know if that's, you know, part of the thing, but as you're speaking, those are the places that my mind is starting to go to.
Yeah, no, these faces, so oftentimes when I'm making mask, or just to simplify it, these needle felted faces in general, I definitely consider them as like holding some kind of spiritual presence or ancestral presence, regardless of how they're being placed. And I think in this piece in particular, I mean, even with the blue mask that I showed, those little faces hanging from the bottom, I just like to think about if A is like the larger image or the larger part of the work, these little faces are adding some kind of not visual support, but like support in something that like feels like it's holding so much more. So ancestry is definitely a big part of how I'm thinking about what these little faces are doing.
That is beautiful. I have a question, and I'm just gonna jump in instead of waiting to the end, because I'm also curious. So Joan is asking, what type of color pigment do you use for the masks?
So this piece, I didn't actually dye the wool. I think I bought like 10 to 15 different pinks from different sources. I knew that I wanted a gradient of some sort, and actually I thought that the gradient would, it wouldn't go line by line vertically, but it would like become a gradient as it wrapped around the neck. And it just didn't read very well. But when I do dye wool, I source the wool from, there's this place called Botanical Colors. And a couple of years ago, I did this plant pigment adult camp that like I fell in love with, because we were just learning about how to turn natural leaves and fibers and whatever into pigment to dye and to paint with. And that was kind of my jump start into working with natural dyes. So this piece doesn't have them. And I can't say it's what is the determining factor for when I use pre-dyed wool or naturally dyed wool. I think it just like indigo feels really good to dye myself. So that's probably always something I'm gonna do, as opposed to buying pre-dyed indigo wool. And I think that's just because like the history and context of the material makes sense with what I'm talking about in the work in general. But it varies.
Wow, that is awesome. Yeah, I love it, and I wish I had the full image, because it's incredible to see this piece on, looks like a pedestal to me, which is very, very long. And so yeah, sorry for pulling the image that doesn't have the full thing.
No.
I love the details here.
Yeah, well, and that's kind of why normally when I share this piece, I think I rarely ever share the image of the full figure, just because it documents it, but it doesn't do the experience of seeing it in person to me.
Sure.
So the detail shots feel like they give you a better glimpse of what experiencing it in person feels like, but seeing the full figure on the photo, it's like, I want to get close to it, but
yes.
You're saying.
We have a question from, I think it's May J, asking, you had these as prints, is what it sounds like, and they're wondering if you would consider re-releasing the prints.
I am not sure. I think that if I ever re-released the prints, I would probably shift the scale in a certain way. But it doesn't feel right to like say I'm not gonna print more and then I print more. so I'm not sure.
That makes sense.
But if it does ever happen, it will, like I said, it'll be in a different scale, and it'll definitely be something that I publicize. So if they follow me, they'll know.
But yes, make sure that you do that follow so that you can find out. And thank you today for putting those into the chat. I love that this is a self-portrait. And of course, I also have a little zoom in, but I won't go there quite yet. I'm just obsessed with the material that you're using and the mashup of materials. I think that's one of the things that just particularly excites me. You know, I couldn't resist but zooming in, you know, on the little heads dangling at the neck. And then also, you know, what the piece is mounted on.
Yeah, I think that I actually am really happy that you followed the pink piece with this one. because this is the second piece in the series that I mentioned that is not complete. I have all these
Beautiful.
dreams of future people to reference and future masked, West African mask to work off of. So my sketchbook is always filled with projects that I'm just waiting to have time to start. But I actually did this piece before the pink one. It's called Your Banks Are Red Honey, Where the Moon, Your Banks Are Full of Red Honey, Where the Moon Wanders. It's a self-portrait. And this is actually pulled from, the title is pulled from a text. So when I mentioned being inspired by Black female writers, this piece is a really great example. I read a couple years ago Ntozake Shange's Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo. And Indigo, one of the characters in the beginning of the book, it focuses on her quite a bit for the first couple chapters, but it's this little girl who makes her own dolls out of like beans and rice and like fabric, and her mother does quilting, and all of her sisters and her mother, they work with their hands a lot, but they all do them in different ways. So Indigo, she makes dolls, and she writes these diary entries about the dolls in a way where she's kind of personifying them, and they're these spiritual beings for her. And one of the passages in her diary entry is called Miraculous Menstruations. And I remember reading that and thinking like, there's nothing miraculous about it, but okay. But this piece kind of counters that, because she's talking about all of these things that it's almost like a how-to create a sacred space and a sacred time for yourself as a woman, as your body is going through this phase. And it talks about what to change your sheets in, and to take a bath, and to do this thing. And I remember thinking, in the vein of thinking about referencing these masks and thinking about worship and ceremonial practices, what it would be like if I created this object that existed in a room where women came as like to commune with each other, or to kind of collectively go through this process that we go through each month, and treated it as a sacred time, and supported ourselves and one another. And this mask or this sculpture, I kind of see it as both a mask and an object, even though you can't actually see out of it, as like becoming this thing that we bring offerings to, as a way of like acknowledging that time for ourselves and our body. So that was how this piece came to be. It's me. I wanted myself to kind of feel like I was resting, as opposed to just closing my eyes and thinking about how I would want to spend such a time, and how we often don't get to spend that time, but like really being inspired by Indigo's words and wanting to treat that whole week of the month so differently. So I remember the outline of the mask is actually pulled from the original mask that I was referencing. And I'm always interested in how I can combine wool with other materials, whether it's like water or concrete. In this case, I started getting into placing wool into soap. So the darker red and the light blue, those pops of blue that you see, it's actually shea butter soap. And the type of soap is important because what shea butter means to me, and like thinking about cocoa butter and shea butter on like the skin of Black women, it's just a material that felt like it was a part of the story. And then there's a resin that's kind of like encasing the soap on top of it. As I worked with the piece, I started realizing that soap likes to do its own thing. So I was like, okay, we need to seal this so I don't have any problems, but that worked perfectly. But I just loved how it felt like this figure is kind of coming out of something, but also, at least for me, feels like it's resting in something, and resting in soap, and thinking about shea butter in terms of hair, but also like cleanliness, and just like all of these different things that for me speak to self-care, and wanting to position the idea of self-care with menstruation.
Wow, that is incredible. Wow. I mean, yeah, it is a sacred. I'm a parent, so I'm like, whenever I'm talking to my wife, I'm just like, yeah, this is it's a super important time of the month. We wouldn't have kids, if you didn't have that ability that, that your body is giving you every single month. So I think it's awesome.
Yeah.
Even though I have never dealt with it myself, still think it's really awesome, right?
Yeah.
Speaks to being able to give forth life. And, this piece also has these little, these heads with so many, and I needed to zoom in on this just to see, how you treated the different complexions of the people, but also like each of them is individual. Like these are not, you could have easily, made a cast or something and decided to just do clay or something where this is really fast. But again, this act of you meticulously creating each and every one of these individually.
That's
Go for it.
Important. And I've thought about, listen, when I'm on like head number 10 or 20 and my hand starts hurting from like doing this motion over and over. But it feels really important to have the faces be different. And I don't actually try to make them different. It's just such a small scale that it almost feels impossible to make them all look exactly alike. No matter how hard I've ever tried to get even the sizes of the heads the same, there's a slight variation in how like that oval takes place. And that just feels really important, especially if thinking about like, if I'm thinking about these heads as holding some kind of ancestral or spiritual presence, as I say, they can't all look the same. They have to be different. So I think like the inability to make them all look the same, just it supports what I want them to be anyway.
Nice. We have this interesting question, and I'm also curious to know about this. Do you have a favorite breed of wool to work with?
I don't have a favorite breed of wool, but so most of my work up until maybe last year has been with merino wool, and that's just kind of what I learned with. As of lately, I've really enjoyed working with batting. It's just a lot more coarse. It's a lot more coarser, and I mean merino wool, I love the way it feels, but like even in front of me, I have chunks of batting that I've dyed, and just the needle seems to work with it a little bit better than I would have ever thought. Especially when I'm making a face. I think with the merino wool, I don't know if I have any around me, but the fibers are kind of all nicely going in the same direction, at least the kind that I've purchased. But the batting is just this coarse bunch of wool, and it is a lot easier to work with when I'm trying to create like a cheek. And I don't want you to see like wool grain going this way. I just want the color of the wool there. So batting is becoming my go-to wool material.
Interesting. That is wild. So I would imagine, also with color, then I'm imagining the merino is because I'm thinking of merino sweaters, my favorite to wear. Yeah. But it's like that you get a consistent color, at least, the things that enter the market, I would imagine. With the batting, would it be a less consistent, like they would put some dark fibers in and some gray fibers? And
no, I think that with the batting, the pre-dyed batting that I've purchased, it seems to be pretty consistent in color. Let me see. So yeah, like this color here is it's called Purple Sunset.
I'm gonna stop sharing real quick so folks can see you.
Yeah, this was pre-dyed batting. And it feels pretty consistent. Sometimes when I buy batting and dye it myself, it'll have like little natural treats in there, little twigs and stuff, which I actually kind of like. But yeah, this seems like, I don't know what their process of dyeing is, but this is something that I purchased, and these are like indigo dyed pieces of batting. I actually really like when there's inconsistencies in color. So that's usually sometimes like a pro to dyeing it myself, because I'm not I'm not a precise person all the time, and that's in a number of different ways. Like, I'm not a numbers person, I'm not precise. I like things to feel good. So like, I remember being at Penland and someone making suggestions for like, oh, you should dye it this way. And I was like, oh, I don't really need it to do it. I don't need it to do that. I just want it to be a color. if it's a different color to the left than it is on the right, that's fine. We're gonna work with it.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's interesting to know. Sorry, I'm nerding out about materials because I love material. And I'm glad there's someone else in the comments also nerds out about specific materials. And here, you know, we have a piece, and I think this is one of these are you have one of these pieces behind you, right?
To the right with the Bantu knots and the dangling heads. As you can see, Bantu knots is like a favorite of mine. I just love the idea of these shapes on top of the head, but that's the one. And and the one furthest to the left is behind me.
Yeah. Awesome. You know, and I just, for me, I was just really excited to see your introduction of performance as well as documenting the works. So they're not just these objects alone, but you're now starting to give them life with this. And I understand these are some of the youth that you worked with.
Yeah, so last summer, I did a 7-week residency in Cleveland, Ohio. And before, we had been talking about the project for that residency for quite some time because they were applying for a grant for it. So it wasn't like I just showed up and, what are you gonna do? Like, there was a lot of conversations about having to really think about what I wanted that work to be. And we landed on a parade, but that was mainly because I knew I wanted to do something with Black youth in Cleveland. And for me, I'm always thinking about, at least within the last year, thinking about access has been really important, and thinking about who has access to people like me in spaces like this and who doesn't. And oftentimes it's not people like the 4 kids in this photo, and wanting to figure out like how I can position my practice, whether it's through workshops or through these communally engaged projects, to bring that to their space. So that was kind of like the determining factor for how this project would unfold. And the idea of a parade just felt really fun. I wanted to do something that like brought a lot of joy to the project and to their space. And after doing the Remembering Her Homecoming project, performance has just felt like a natural part of what to incorporate with the mask making that I'm doing. So these 4 students they're a part of this program at Karamu House. It's a theater program in Cleveland. And I think it's one of the oldest theater companies in the country, Black-owned theater companies in the country. So they have a youth department where I actually got to see them. I went to one of their plays. I got to see them perform and talked to their director about having them be a part of my parade, because I wanted, and there's another, there were 2 groups. There was like a youth band and youth performers. And I wanted there to be a group of kids that they almost kind of became the lead characters. Lots of kids participated, but I knew I wanted a group of kids who felt comfortable in this performance-like manner. And it was so natural to them. I have a video that's being worked on from this performance that's not finished yet, but I was watching the draft of it and looking at the rehearsal of the day of me like putting this parade in their hands. I was like, I'm making the mask, but I don't want you guys to feel like you're performing my project as much as I want you to feel like you're either performing ours or performing yours. And I'm just here to help like facilitate or support that and what that looks like. So like they came to the gallery space, which was treated as a studio space. And I kind of put out what the ideas were. There were ideas that I had that we scrapped because they were like, well, we want to do it this way. And I was like, well, the floor is yours. So we're scrapping this idea. And I think there's a lot of like trust and like, I don't know if it's like ego checking that has to take place to be able to like put that amount of confidence and not only someone else's hands, but like the hands of children. And teenagers would be like, okay, you guys got it. I trust you. You know what you're doing. But it worked out beautifully. And the parade wouldn't have gone the way it did without their energy, and the energy of the bands and all the kids that participated. But so to backtrack a little bit, when I got to Cleveland, it was important, and you talked about process and the importance of like people getting to see the process and not just the finished project. And that was like the most important thing about my time in Cleveland. Even if I didn't get to do a parade, because we were nervous about weather, if I didn't get to do a parade, I was happy with how I treated the weeks leading up to it. So as soon as I got there and we got materials, I started doing these pop-up workshops where I would just, a residency staff member would join me, and we would just take a 6-foot fold-out table, a bunch of wool and soap and water, and one of the masks that I'd already started to work on, and we would pick a different neighborhood a couple times a week and just set up a table at the end of a street or near a church or somewhere that felt like socially appropriate to invite kids you don't know to come participate. There were moments where I was like, is it kind of crazy to try to like ride around looking for kids? But we would just sit there and I'd have materials out, and like in groups of smaller, large kids would come and like, what are you guys doing? And they would bring their parents. And it was a great way to kind of like talk about the parade and the hopes for the project. And they would just stand at the table. There was no, it felt very organic and very casual in terms of like, you don't have to sign up for this. There's not a fee. There's like no criteria other than like, if you're interested, you can participate. If you're not, there were kids who didn't want to do it, but they wanted to hang out and watch their friends. So they would just like sit on their bike and everyone's talking and they're watching and their friends are wet felting, and they would take their pieces and bike away and go off about their day. And there was like, no, you didn't have to commit to anything. It was just, I wanted to find a genuine way to kind of share the process with kids who most likely aren't learning felting in their public art programs. So though that was like some of the most special moments of my time in Cleveland, and that was the first time I had done something like that. I've always taught workshops, but I think doing it in a way, and I remember the young woman, Layla, who was helping me, she was like, this is making me think about the ways in which our programs need to come to people as opposed to expecting people to come to us. And I remember, to bounce around a little bit, I remember reading an article that this gallerist was talking about growing up in France and going to museums and wondering if those spaces were made for her and if she was supposed to be in that space. And thinking with this project, I felt like what it did was not trying to figure out how to get people to come and do this thing here. And like, because I think oftentimes spaces have to consider who feels comfortable or who feels welcomed or invited to come to a contemporary space. And I think like that in general just kind of speaks to like certain structures and approaches needing to be reworked. I'm getting off subject, but it's all a part of what this project was doing. And the importance of like coming to their neighborhood and doing this thing. And it just felt really good to do. They loved it. People were like, oh, we want to do the parade. We saw a lot of repeated faces during the day of the parade. We did Indigo Dying. So there were a group of kids who we took this field trip to this textile and weaving studio where they taught us Indigo Dying. And the kids, they were a part of this camp and they got to spend their day doing indigo dyeing, and we visited the garden, and I was just like, yes, this is what I wanted. And it was so funny because one of the kids in the back, it was one of the young boys, he was like, I don't really want to be here. And then this was on the bus on our way to the studio. And then when we were there, he was like, oh, I'm going to give this indigo scarf to my grandma. Like, he was just so hyped. And I was like, yes, I'm out here changing minds.
I love that. I love that. I love that there's a whole social practice aspect of this. And you know, it's not just, it's not art for art's sake. It's not just art for the aesthetic purpose, but the, you know, the concepts and ideas behind your work also materialize in, the work that you're doing, particularly with the youth and moving around the community. And changing, working in the education and changing kids' minds. I'm sure he's like, one of the best things that he's ever done. And I'm sure he's still doing it to some degree.
Yeah, they were so excited watching them dip the fabric in, like, because they made these little scarves, watching them dip it in the dye bath and like wanting to like try different like shibori tying methods and like what happens. Like they started getting really creative and doing some stuff that we probably shouldn't have been doing in this lady's dye bath. But I didn't feel comfortable telling them to stop because I feel like the learning happens in the play and the fail and play again. So like I was like, try it. I don't know what's gonna happen.
I because of time,
yeah.
I threw this one in there because I love the scale of it. But I want to jump forward to your new work, because I am just extra fascinated by your movement into quilting, and of course I love the beadwork that you have incorporated throughout this. But then also the felting comes in. I mean, you're just bringing together so many different aspects of your creative process all together, and it's coming together beautifully.
Yeah. Thank you. Actually, this piece is the sketch that I have behind me. So I think it's cool that you guys get to see like what I was working on from this and get to see it and it coming to fruition. So this was the work that I was talking about in terms of like wanting to see what happens with taking these three materials that I kind of like slowly fell in love with at one point or another and just seeing what happens when they all come together. And I didn't know if it was going to work. I was like, is this going to be chaotic? But like, isn't there such thing as good chaos? So that was kind of like the kind of the inspiration or the desire to see what happens when all three of these things that I love enter into the same space. But also like at the time I started thinking about glitches, the work that this piece is from, or the body of work this piece is from, was kind of tapping into like family relationships and memory, and all of that made sense with like understanding the word collage. This is a photo, the top portion is a photo of my grandfather who's now passed, holding me and my brother when we were younger, collaged onto me kind of lounging on the couch. So I started thinking about these domestic scenes of me sitting in my home intimate space with these images that feel intimate and close to me. And what I love most about this image is that once I started playing around on Photoshop with bringing these two images together, the size of my hand and the way it was laying almost fit perfectly with where my grandfather's hand was. And that's only important because my boyfriend can tell you, whenever I talk to him about my grandfather, I'm always either talking about how tall he was, his afro, or how large his hands were. And as a little kid, his hands felt like they were like the size of my whole body.
Yeah.
So it felt like this really special moment to see my hand kind of drift into his place. And that was kind of the vehicle that was determining how these images came into like existing with one another. And with the idea of a glitch or a memory, I would be lying if I said I remember this day specifically, but it feels like I remember it because we have these images and thinking about what memories are for us. And sometimes a memory is a bunch of things that were told to you and it feels so clear that now the memory is yours, when 9 times out of 10 it's a collaged memory. So that was kind of how I was thinking about collaging these materials and collaging these processes while also collaging the imagery. So like a triple collage in a sense for what I wanted to do with these. And the show, so this is a part of the show that I mentioned with Avery earlier. The piece in its entirety is a blanket. So this is the front of the blanket and it's draping over these towel rods. And as I was working on this piece and I talked with Avery about it in the beginning, I was like, it feels really important that this quilt or tapestry isn't framed, like something.
Mm-hmm.
Our show is kind of tapping into the space of home, and the things that home holds outside of just our physical bodies, but like memory and archive, and history and sound and color. And I was like, well, thinking about the things that exist in our home spaces, I wanted something that felt like a functional object, and it felt very natural that these tapestries became something like a towel that would be draped. So in the space, they're hung very low, because it also felt important that, you know, your towel rod isn't gallery heavy, height. It's much lower, so you can kind of manipulate the material and dry your hands, so it's functional. And the woman, her name is Patty Lyons, she fabricated those rods. I don't know if I sent you a close-up.
You did, so I'm gonna actually kind of zoom in first on the details of the hand with all the other surrounding materials that I am jazzed about. Here's a little, because you know I'm clearly a bead nerd. Is this all embroidered, or is this also some off loom weaving and then attached?
So I embroidered, the beadwork is done on like my little embroidery hoop, or sometimes I'll get like a picture frame or a canvas frame, and then I'm just embedding it onto the surface of the fabric, cut out the shape that I need, and attach it to the larger surface.
That is incredible. So all this is embroidered, but it's so tight.
Yeah, I like, so when I say I'm not precise, it's like I don't need things to be like quote unquote right, but I need them to feel good. And there's something that feels really good about having smaller beads around the edge. You can't really tell in this photo, but the beads get smaller around the edge of the shadow shape and get bigger in the center. So from the side, it's almost like this level, this rounded shape that comes off of the surface, as opposed to these beads that just sit on the fabric. And it's like such a delight to like, someone else also complimented on how tight the beads get. And I think everybody like them. I've taught my mom and my sister how to bead, so they oftentimes become studio assistants. And when I have to like go in between their beads to add more beads, they're like, "Is it not good enough?" And I'm like, "It's great. It's just I need it to be like jam packed with beads."
Yeah, I mean, just the pure mastery. I mean, I'm even looking at the lines of how you cut the fabric out, and then you're sewing, you know, the different pieces together to create the shadows and everything. It's like it's just a delight for me to see your mastery of so many different materials. You mentioned 3, but I mean, I think we're looking at like 5 or 6 right here alone.
So this detail is probably one of my favorites. As I mentioned, I did not make, I was a part of the design process of this, but I approached this iron or metal artist that I know, and I thought that wood would hold these tapestries up. And at some point, actually while I was at Penland, I called Patty and I was like, it can't be wood. Who has wooden towel rods? I mean, maybe they exist, but usually they're metal. And I was like, and I can't do this myself. I was fine with building a wooden structure to hold these, but I was like, no, this needs to be someone else. And she was excited and up for the task. The face on the end is actually not metal, it's 3D printed. Which I really appreciate. This was the first time I've seen one of my faces in a material other than wool. And originally I gave her a couple different faces of different scales or different sizes that I had felted. And she was going to try to kind of like remake it out of iron, which is the rest of the material of the rod. And we both agreed that we were happy that she didn't do that, because her face would have been different than my face. So seeing it casted feels like one of the heads from my quilt was like plucked off and put at the end of this towel rod. And it just feels like a chef's kiss. When I saw, she sent me pictures, I was like, Patty, hold up, girl. I was just so like, it was better and more beautiful than I imagined. And I think I wanted something that was a continuation of what was happening on the surface. So even the twist and the coil that happens in the back and the treatment of the horizontal physical rod that's holding the tapestry, like it all just feels like it's speaking the language that I'm speaking in the work.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, so yeah, I love it. And then, you know, definitely wanted to go back so that folks could see all the different pieces that you're talking about. We will zoom forward, and I believe we have a detail of a different piece here.
Yes. I don't know if I sent you the whole, but so this is from a tapestry. This is me when I was a baby. My aunt is holding me and it's collaged with an image of me. So in the full image, it looks like older Nastassja is holding baby Nastassja. How I collaged it. And again, just kind of like going, it's me sitting on the couch and then it's my aunt holding me sitting while she's sitting on the couch, and just wanting to figure out ways to put these past and present moments together that speak to memory. Again, of course, at this age, I have no memory of this moment, but I've seen this image 1,000 times. And it feels special, and it feels like something you want to try to remember. I feel like that often happens when you're looking at old photos. It's like, oh, we're getting something from this image. I wish I could remember this moment or this place at this time. And making these quilts almost feels like I'm retracing them. Like as I'm working on the images for so long, it feels like I'm trying to pinpoint in my mind when it happened. And again, my love for beaded work. And I don't talk about it often because it's not a primary part of my work, but wet felting has been like seeping into the cracks, and the garment that the baby me is wearing, as well as what's happening around my head, like the little that's wet felted wool that I've then kind of like stitched patterning on top of. And it's just like playing with, in my studio, the different ways to create, like turn the material into something else that I need it to be. I'm usually not a big fan of wet felting. I end up having to do it a lot when I'm working large scale or working with masks, because I get to create like a template for myself. But as I started, I think this was the first time I began wet felting where I like really enjoyed what was happening. And as I was like putting these colors in and knowing that I wanted them to be like ambiguous flowers that I would then stitch on top of, because the dress that I was wearing in the original photo was kind of like that old 90s or early 90s super floral print. And my dress matched the bottoms and matched the headband, and it was all just like floral down. But wanting to somehow maintain a bit of that aesthetic, I was like, oh, I can't wait to stitch on top of these and have these like flowers and plants and lines going in every direction. And then the beaded collar felt like a nice place to put that detail. Like as I was working on these, sometimes the original sketch or the original plan from Photoshop shifted, and I'm like, oh, like originally this face was going to be beaded. It would have been like a silhouette face and you wouldn't have seen my face, but
oh my goodness,
I really enjoyed shifting that and using the line work on top to kind of like draw and paint in a way. So these are moments where like my background in painting and drawing find itself in the like finished product of the fiber work.
That's incredible. Yeah, I love the juxtaposition of the different materials that you're using and the different processes. You know, those are so amazing. I love to be able to see them in a single piece all come together. We are at our time, but I do want to ask the question that Yvette was asking about, you know, do you have other pieces in Philadelphia on display? I guess you had, Yvette really wants to see your work in Philly.
The only piece that is currently in Philly is actually a painting that I did a couple years ago of my two sisters. It's at the Color Girls Museum in North Philly. That would be the only place, I believe, where you can see my work in Philly right now. But they own that piece, so it'll always be.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, so go check that out in Philly, and then maybe more will be coming. And then just kind of last question for you before we sign off is what's next for you? What are shows, residencies, fairs? When are you coming to California?
I hope to be in California. I won't say very soon, but hopefully in the near future. I currently am working on 2 outdoor installations. One is kind of a self-directed project that I wanted to do a couple years ago, and I've just been slowly making it happen. It's this 13-foot metal boat that will hold needle-felted life-size children. So I'll make a series of life-size figures of kids in different colors, and they'll be in this boat. It's called Castaway, and it's along the story of these 4 or 5, depending on how my hands feel, these 4 or 5 Black children that have decided that they are constructing a boat to set sail and find new land and start their own country. And they'll travel through different sites along the East Coast to kind of like spread the word to other kids, to say, hey, we're doing this thing. America's not where it's at anymore. Let's find new land and we'll start our own space. So I'm excited about that project because there's a great deal of programming and interacting with youth that I'm interested in doing. So there's that. And then I just was selected to do my first public art piece in Richmond, Virginia. So that will be happening in the next few months. A little nervous, but very excited. I have a great deal of support of people like helping me get through this first time thing, but public art is not an easy thing to get into. So I'm like, thanks for taking a chance on me. So it feels like heavy, a lot of pressure, but I feel good that it's gonna be great.
Oh, that's incredible.
I also have some, like, communal programming and interacting with youth as well. So I'm excited that like that piece of my practice gets to continue in both of those projects.
Yes, please bring that to the West Coast, please. I would love to see that here. Maybe we can come up with something with Moad, as Joan said earlier in the conversation.
I will happily. I think someone by the name of Joan said it needs to come.
Yes.
I was gonna type yes, it does, but I couldn't reach my keyboard.
we will devise some kind of way to make that happen other than just this virtual platform. Nastassja, thank you so much for sharing so much of your time, your talents, your energy, your thoughts, and just your inspiration. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you for having me. I like when I get to stop my hands and do a lot of chatting. So thank you.
Yeah, it's really great to add the layers to your work, the literal layers, and for us all to hear about them. And also thank you for everyone who joined us today. Like I said at the beginning, we will have this talk on YouTube. If you joined us late, I saw some people came in a little bit later. The talk will be on Moad's YouTube channel, or you can look on Facebook and you'll see it right away also. All right, well, thank you everyone. And we will see you next month with our next artist. Thank you so much, Nastassja. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you, you too.
Okay, take care, bye-bye.